"The man you are about to arrest spent his life defending this country. But you are about to make the biggest mistake of your career." The words were never spoken that morning, but they would echo through the halls of power before the day was over. Under the gray morning sky of Arlington, Virginia, a quiet street outside a government building became the place where a lifetime of service collided with a moment of prejudice. Marcus Reynolds stood near the sidewalk, holding a simple leather folder in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. He looked like any other man heading to a meeting. No uniform, no medals, no group of officers standing beside him. Just a calm presence, a respectful posture, and the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades carrying responsibility on his shoulders. But to Officer Derek Whitmore, none of that mattered. Derek saw only what he expected to see. A black man standing near a restricted area. A person he believed needed to be questioned. And before a single conversation could become an understanding, suspicion had already replaced curiosity. "Step away from the entrance," Derek said firmly as he approached. His voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Marcus slowly turned, his expression calm. "Good morning, officer. I believe there may be a misunderstanding." Those words should have been enough to begin a conversation. They should have been an invitation to listen. But Derek had already made up his mind. He asked for identification. Marcus reached into his wallet and handed over his government identification. Derek glanced at it quickly, but instead of recognizing the significance, he dismissed it with a look of doubt. "You expect me to believe that?" he asked. Marcus studied the officer for a moment. Not with anger, not with fear, but with disappointment, because Marcus had seen this before. Not on battlefields, not during overseas missions, but in ordinary moments where people decided who someone was before learning their story. Imagine spending 35 years serving a nation, making difficult decisions, protecting lives, and leading thousands of soldiers through uncertainty, only to stand in front of someone who sees none of that because of a single assumption. Marcus Reynolds was not a man who needed to announce his accomplishments. He had never measured his worth by titles or recognition. For years, he had worn the uniform of the United States Army, stood beside soldiers from every background, and learned that true leadership was never about demanding respect. It was about earning it. But today, he was not wearing that uniform. Today, he was simply Marcus Reynolds. And that was exactly what made Derek believe he had the upper hand. "You need to come with me," Derek said. The surrounding area became quieter. A few people walking nearby slowed down. Some looked over with curiosity. Others pulled out their phones, sensing that something unusual was happening. Marcus looked around at the faces watching him and then back at the officer standing in front of him. He could have explained everything. He could have mentioned his rank, his years of service, and the people who knew his name. But he chose silence, because Marcus wanted to understand something more important than proving who he was. He wanted to see what happened when someone with authority forgot the responsibility that came with it. Derek thought he was dealing with an ordinary man. He thought he was in control of the situation. He had no idea that the person standing in front of him was a decorated U.S. Army general whose name was known far beyond that street. And he certainly had no idea that one simple phone call could change everything. The badge on Derek's chest gave him authority. But Marcus carried something far greater. A lifetime of service. A lifetime of sacrifice. And a truth that was about to be revealed. The first thing Marcus Reynolds noticed was not the officer standing in front of him. It was the silence around them, the kind of silence that appears when people are unsure whether they should step forward or simply watch. The morning traffic continued moving through Arlington, Virginia, but on that sidewalk, time seemed to slow. Marcus remained calm, holding his folder close to his side, while Officer Derek Whitmore continued asking questions that had already been answered. "Where are you going?" Derek asked again. Marcus looked toward the government building behind him before calmly responding, "I have a scheduled meeting." His voice carried no anger, no frustration, only patience. That patience seemed to bother Derek more than anything else. The officer was used to seeing people become nervous when questioned. He was used to people trying to explain themselves quickly, trying to prove they belonged. But Marcus did not rush. He did not argue. He simply stood there with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was. Years earlier, Marcus Reynolds had walked through places where every decision mattered. As a United States Army general, he had led soldiers through difficult moments and carried responsibilities that few people could understand. He had spent decades learning one important lesson. Emotions could cloud judgment, but discipline revealed character. That lesson stayed with him now, because this moment was not just about one misunderstanding on one street. It was about what people chose to see when they looked at someone they did not know. Derek looked at Marcus and saw a problem. Marcus looked at Derek and saw a person who had forgotten the importance of listening. "Officer," Marcus said quietly, "before this goes any further, I think you should take another look at my identification." Derek glanced down once more. He noticed the official markings. He noticed the information. But instead of curiosity, he responded with more doubt. To him, Marcus was still just someone who needed to be controlled. Around them, the small crowd continued growing. A woman leaving a nearby office building paused for a moment. A man carrying a briefcase looked over his shoulder. Nobody knew the full story yet. Nobody knew the years of service, hidden behind the calm expression of the man standing there. But some people began to sense that something was different. Marcus was not acting like someone who was afraid. He was acting like someone who was waiting for the truth to arrive on its own. The interesting thing about real power is that it does not always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly. Sometimes it listens. Sometimes it allows people to reveal who they are before saying a single word. Derek did not understand that. He believed silence meant weakness. He believed calmness meant uncertainty. He believed the situation belonged to him. But Marcus had spent a lifetime around leaders, and he knew something Derek had forgotten. A person's position does not define their character. Their choices do. As Derek prepared to continue the situation, Marcus looked down at his phone for a brief moment. Several messages had appeared from people who knew exactly where he was and why he was there. He could have ended everything in seconds. One introduction, one name, one explanation. But he chose not to, because Marcus Reynolds wanted to see something clearly. He wanted to know whether the system would recognize the truth before he revealed it. And at that moment, Derek Whitmore was about to discover that the quiet man in front of him was not someone waiting to be saved. He was someone who had spent his entire life protecting others. The only question was how long it would take before everyone else realized it too. The street outside the government building had become a place of quiet tension. Minutes earlier, Marcus Reynolds had been preparing for an ordinary meeting, expecting nothing more than a normal morning. Now, he stood beneath the pale Virginia sunlight while Officer Derek Whitmore continued treating him like a person who needed to prove he belonged. But Marcus remained unchanged. His posture was steady. His voice remained respectful. His expression showed the discipline of someone who had learned that every reaction carried meaning. Derek looked at the identification again, searching for something that would support the conclusion he had already made. The problem was not the information in front of him. The problem was that he had already decided what he wanted to believe. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," Derek said. Marcus looked at him carefully. Sometimes the hardest thing is simply allowing someone to explain. That sentence stayed in the air for a moment. A few people nearby exchanged glances. They could feel that this was no longer just a simple question between an officer and a citizen. It had become a moment where assumptions were being tested. Marcus knew moments like this could reveal more about a person than any official title ever could. During his years in the United States Army, he had met people from every background imaginable. He had worked alongside soldiers who did not look the same, speak the same, or come from the same places. But they shared one thing. They understood that respect was earned through actions. Marcus had never believed that a uniform alone made someone honorable. A uniform was only meaningful when the person wearing it understood the responsibility behind it. Derek, however, saw authority differently. To him, the badge on his chest represented control. He had spent years believing that people should immediately obey when he spoke. And when Marcus did not react with fear or frustration, Derek interpreted that calmness as a challenge. "You seem very confident for someone in this situation," Derek said. Marcus gave a small nod. "Confidence is not the same as disrespect." The response was simple, but it carried the weight of experience. Marcus was not trying to win an argument. He was not trying to embarrass anyone. He was simply refusing to surrender his dignity. A young man standing nearby quietly watched the interaction. He noticed something unusual about Marcus. The older man did not look defeated. He looked patient, like someone who had already seen the ending of a story that everyone else was still trying to understand. A few minutes passed. The meeting Marcus was scheduled to attend was getting closer. His phone continued receiving messages, but he ignored them. There were people who could have arrived immediately. There were officials who would have recognized his name within seconds. But Marcus stayed where he was, because sometimes the most powerful lesson is not delivered through influence. Sometimes it comes from allowing the truth to reveal itself naturally. Derek finally stepped back and looked toward the entrance of the building. He still believed he was dealing with an ordinary situation. He still believed Marcus was simply another person who needed to be corrected. He did not know that the man standing in front of him had spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of lives. He did not know that Marcus Reynolds was respected far beyond that street. And he definitely did not know that the next few minutes would transform a routine encounter into a lesson about judgment, responsibility, and the difference between having authority and understanding it. The longer the moment lasted, the clearer the truth became. Not the truth written on a document. Not the truth printed on an identification card, but the truth revealed by how people treated someone when they believed no one important was watching. Marcus Reynolds stood quietly near the entrance of the government building, observing every detail around him. The movement of people walking by, the uncomfortable silence from those who had stopped to watch, the careful distance everyone kept, unsure whether they should speak or stay invisible. He had seen that hesitation before. Not during military operations, not during moments of national importance, but in ordinary places where people faced difficult choices. Would they stand for what was right, or would they simply look away? Officer Derek Whitmore remained convinced that he was in complete control. He continued asking questions, repeating demands, and expecting Marcus to respond the way he imagined someone in that position should respond. Nervous, confused, defensive. But Marcus gave him none of those reactions. "You have every right to ask questions," Marcus said calmly. "But you also have a responsibility to listen to the answers." Derek paused for a moment. There was something about Marcus that did not fit the situation. The man was not trying to escape attention. He was not searching for an excuse. He was simply standing there with a level of patience that made the entire encounter feel different. Years of leadership had taught Marcus something important. The loudest person in the room was not always the strongest. Sometimes the strongest person was the one who could remain calm when others expected anger. He remembered countless moments throughout his career when emotions could have damaged decisions. Leaders were not measured by how quickly they reacted. They were measured by how wisely they responded. That lesson had followed him from his earliest days in uniform to this quiet street in Virginia. Derek looked around and noticed the growing attention from nearby people. A few individuals were watching from a distance. Some whispered quietly, others simply observed. The situation was no longer private. Every word mattered. Every choice mattered. Marcus understood that better than anyone. "Do you know how many people I have met who carried important titles?" Marcus asked. Derek looked at him without answering. "The title is never what defines them. The choices they make when they have authority do." The words were calm, but they carried a weight that came from experience. Derek did not respond immediately. For a brief moment there was a crack in his certainty. A small moment where doubt appeared, but pride quickly covered it again. He looked at Marcus as if trying to figure out why this man refused to act intimidated. What Derek did not understand was that Marcus was not waiting for someone else to give him power. He had spent a lifetime learning that true power came from discipline, integrity, and service. His phone vibrated again. Another message appeared. Another person was trying to reach him. Marcus looked at the screen but still did not answer. The time had come close enough. The situation had reached the point where silence had taught everything it could teach. But before making that call, Marcus wanted one more thing. He wanted Derek to understand that the person standing in front of him was not defined by assumptions, not by appearances, not by the limited story someone created after a single glance. Because behind the quiet expression, behind the simple clothing, behind the ordinary appearance, was a lifetime of commitment that stretched far beyond that sidewalk. And soon, everyone would understand that the man they underestimated was someone the entire nation had trusted with far greater responsibilities. The phone in Marcus Reynolds' hand remained silent, even though he knew the world beyond that street was already moving. For most people, a moment like this would have been about proving themselves. It would have been about saying the right name, showing the right credentials, and making sure everyone understood who they were dealing with. But Marcus had spent his entire life learning something different. Real authority did not need to announce itself. It did not need to demand recognition. It revealed itself through patience, through character, and through the choices made when no one expected accountability. Officer Derek Whitmore still stood with the same confidence he had carried from the beginning. He looked at Marcus and saw someone who refused to cooperate. He did not see the years of service. He did not see the leadership. He did not see the countless decisions Marcus had made while carrying responsibilities most people would never experience. He only saw the story he had created in his own mind. And that was the mistake. Marcus looked toward the entrance of the building, then back at Derek. "Officer, I want you to understand something," Marcus said. "A person can have authority and still forget what that authority is for." Derek gave a slight smile, believing Marcus was simply trying to sound important. "You keep talking like you are someone special," he replied. Marcus did not react. He had heard versions of that statement throughout his career. People often misunderstood confidence when it came from someone they did not expect to have it. They confused calmness with weakness. They confused respect with surrender. But Marcus knew the difference. He had worn the uniform of the United States Army for decades, but the uniform had never created his values. It only represented the values he already carried. Nearby, a former service member who had been watching quietly suddenly looked closer. There was something familiar about Marcus. The posture, the way he stood, the way he listened before speaking. Those details were easy to miss unless someone understood what they meant. The former soldier whispered to the person beside him, "That man is not who they think he is." But Marcus heard none of it. His focus remained on Derek. He was not interested in embarrassing him. He was not interested in making a scene. He was interested in seeing whether a person given authority would recognize the responsibility that came with it. The world often reveals people in small moments. Not when cameras are present. Not when speeches are being made. But when they believe nobody important is watching. Derek checked the time and glanced toward the building. He seemed determined to finish the situation his way. "You are coming with me," he said. Marcus took a slow breath. For the first time that morning, he looked down at his phone with a different expression. Not anger, not frustration, just acceptance that the moment had arrived. The moment when silence had done its job. He opened the phone and looked at the screen filled with unanswered messages from people who knew exactly where he was. People who knew the significance of his name. People who understood the level of responsibility he had carried for years. Derek still did not know. He believed he was dealing with an ordinary person caught in an ordinary situation. But some truths remain hidden only until the right moment arrives. Marcus Reynolds had spent a lifetime serving a country that he believed in. Now, standing on a quiet street, he was about to make one decision that would reveal everything. Not to gain power, not to seek revenge, but because sometimes the only way to correct a misunderstanding is to allow the truth to finally speak for itself. Marcus Reynolds looked at the screen of his phone for a few seconds longer than anyone expected. Around him, the sounds of the city continued as normal. Cars moved along the road. People walked toward their offices. Conversations continued between strangers who had no idea that a quiet moment on a sidewalk was about to become something much larger. Officer Derek Whitmore watched carefully, still convinced that Marcus was finally realizing he had no choice but to accept the situation. But Derek misunderstood the silence. He thought Marcus was searching for a way out. He did not understand that Marcus was making a decision. For decades, Marcus had learned that leadership was not about reacting quickly. It was about knowing when action was necessary and when patience could reveal more than words ever could. He had spent years surrounded by people who carried different ranks, different responsibilities, and different levels of authority. The greatest leaders he knew were never the ones who needed everyone to know their importance. They were the ones who remained calm because they understood their purpose. Marcus finally raised the phone to his ear. The movement was simple, almost ordinary, but something about it changed the atmosphere around him. A few people nearby looked up. Derek noticed the change but could not explain it. "Who are you calling?" Derek asked. Marcus looked at him and calmly answered, "Someone who needs to be informed." There was no anger in his voice, no attempt to intimidate, just a simple statement from a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The call connected. Marcus stood quietly for a moment before speaking. "This is General Marcus Reynolds," he said. The words were not loud. They did not need to be, but they carried a weight that changed everything. On the other end of the line, the person immediately recognized the name. The conversation became focused and professional. Marcus briefly explained where he was, what had happened, and why he believed the situation required attention. He did not exaggerate. He did not complain. He simply reported the facts. That was who Marcus had always been. A person who understood that truth did not need dramatic presentation. It only needed to be heard. Derek watched the call with growing uncertainty. The confidence he had carried earlier began to fade. He had expected excuses. He had expected panic. He had expected someone trying to convince him they mattered. Instead, he was watching someone who had no need to prove anything. A few minutes later, another person nearby recognized the name. The former service member who had been watching quietly stepped closer and looked at Marcus with surprise. "General Reynolds?" he said softly. The name alone was enough to change the expressions of several people standing nearby. Derek heard it. He saw the reaction. And for the first time that morning, he began questioning whether he had understood the situation at all. Marcus ended the call and placed the phone back in his pocket. He looked at Derek with the same calm expression he had shown from the beginning. "Officer," Marcus said, "the purpose of authority is not to make people feel powerless. It is to make sure people are treated fairly." Derek did not answer immediately. The street that had once felt like his territory suddenly felt different. The same badge was still on his chest. The same building stood behind Marcus. But the balance of the moment had changed. Because the man he believed needed to explain himself had just revealed that he was someone whose voice reached far beyond that sidewalk. And now the truth was no longer hidden. It was on its way. The call had ended, but the impact of those few words had only just begun. General Marcus Reynolds stood quietly near the entrance of the government building, holding the same folder he had carried since the beginning of the morning. Nothing about his appearance had changed. He was still wearing simple clothes. He was still calm. He was still the same man who had patiently answered every question asked of him. But the way people looked at him had changed completely. Officer Derek Whitmore stood frozen in a moment of realization. The situation he thought he understood was no longer the same. The person he believed needed to explain himself had just revealed a lifetime of service that existed far beyond what could be seen on the surface. Marcus noticed the change in the atmosphere, but he did not celebrate it. He did not smile. He did not use the moment to make Derek feel small. That was never who Marcus was. Throughout his military career, Marcus had learned that leadership was not about proving someone wrong. It was about doing what was right, even when emotions made it difficult. The people who knew Marcus best often said the same thing about him. He carried authority quietly because he understood the responsibility behind it. A few moments later, a representative from the building approached after receiving information about the situation. The person looked at Marcus with immediate recognition and respect. "General Reynolds, we were not aware this was happening," the representative said. Marcus simply nodded. "I know. That is why we need to understand what happened." His response surprised everyone. He was not focused on himself. He was not demanding special treatment. He was focused on the bigger question. How did a situation like this happen in the first place? Derek watched carefully as the conversation continued. He expected anger. He expected a powerful person to use his position to make demands. Instead, he saw something completely different. He saw restraint. He saw professionalism. He saw someone who had every opportunity to turn the moment into a personal victory but chose a different path. "Officer Whitmore," Marcus said calmly, turning toward him, "the problem is not that you asked questions. Asking questions is part of your responsibility. The problem is what happens when questions are asked without fairness." Those words carried more weight than any accusation could have. Because Marcus was not trying to destroy a person. He was trying to expose a lesson. Around them, the people who had been watching began to understand the deeper meaning of what had happened. This was not just about one officer and one general. It was about the difference between authority and accountability. It was about how quickly assumptions could replace understanding. Derek looked down for a moment. The confidence he had carried earlier was gone. In its place was uncertainty. He had believed that having a badge meant having the final word. But now he was facing a truth he had not expected. A person's value was never determined by how others judged them at first glance. Marcus gathered his folder and prepared to enter the building. The meeting he came for was still waiting. The responsibilities he carried had not disappeared. But before walking away, he looked back at Derek one final time. "Every person you meet has a story you do not know," Marcus said. "Never let an assumption become the reason you fail to see the person in front of you." Then he turned and walked toward the entrance. The crowd slowly began to move again. The morning continued, but for everyone who witnessed that moment, something had changed. Because the most powerful lesson was not that Marcus Reynolds held an important position. The lesson was that even without the title, even without the recognition, his character had already spoken for him. The building doors closed behind Marcus Reynolds, but the moment outside continued to follow everyone who had witnessed it. The street that had started as a place of confusion had become a place of reflection. People who had stopped to watch were now walking away with a different understanding of what they had seen. They had expected a confrontation. Instead, they witnessed something much more powerful. They witnessed a man with every reason to respond emotionally, choose patience instead. Inside the government building, Marcus moved through the familiar halls with the same calm focus he had carried all morning. For him, the situation was not over simply because his identity had been recognized. The real question remained: what could be learned from that moment? Marcus had spent decades serving his country, and he knew that the strongest organizations were not built by pretending mistakes never happened. They were built by acknowledging them, learning from them, and making sure they did not become someone else's burden in the future. Meanwhile, Officer Derek Whitmore remained outside, thinking about everything that had happened. The confidence he carried earlier had been replaced by uncomfortable reflection. He replayed the conversation in his mind. Every question, every assumption, every moment when he chose not to listen. What stayed with him most was not the fact that Marcus was a general. It was the realization that his behavior would have been wrong even if Marcus had been anyone else. That was the lesson he had not understood at first. Respect should not depend on a person's title, position, or influence. It should exist before any of those things are known. Later that afternoon, a formal review of the encounter began. The focus was not on punishment or public attention. The focus was understanding what happened and why. Marcus provided his perspective with the same calm honesty he had shown from the beginning. He did not exaggerate. He did not seek revenge. He simply described the events and explained why moments like these mattered. A system becomes stronger when it is willing to examine itself, Marcus said. Those words reached people who had expected a completely different response. Many believed someone in his position would demand immediate consequences. But Marcus understood something deeper. Removing one person from a situation does not automatically solve the beliefs or habits that created the situation. Real change requires awareness. It requires accountability. It requires people to look honestly at their own decisions. Derek listened as the conversation continued. For the first time, he was not listening to defend himself. He was listening to understand. He realized that the man he had judged in a matter of seconds had spent a lifetime judging himself by a much higher standard. Marcus had carried the responsibility of protecting others, yet he never used that responsibility as an excuse to look down on anyone. The difference between them was not simply rank. It was perspective. As the sun began to set over Virginia, the events of the day slowly became a reminder of something everyone could understand. A uniform can represent authority, but it does not automatically create wisdom. A position can create influence, but it does not automatically create character. Those things come from choices. And on that day, Marcus Reynolds showed that true strength was not found in proving that you had power. It was found in knowing how to use it responsibly. The days that followed that morning in Virginia carried a quiet reminder for everyone involved. For Marcus Reynolds, life continued with the same purpose it always had. Meetings, responsibilities, and conversations that required careful attention filled his schedule. But the moment on that sidewalk remained in his thoughts because he understood something important. The most meaningful lessons are often found in ordinary moments. They are found in how people treat someone when they do not know that person's story. Marcus had spent a lifetime serving a country built on the idea that every person deserved dignity and respect. He had seen people from different backgrounds stand together for a common purpose. He had watched young soldiers discover that teamwork was not built on appearances or assumptions. It was built on trust. That was why the encounter with Officer Derek Whitmore mattered. It was never just about one interaction. It represented a choice that many people face every day. The choice between judging quickly or taking the time to understand. Weeks later, Marcus returned to the same area where everything had happened. The street looked completely ordinary. People walked by carrying coffee cups. Office workers moved between buildings, and the sounds of the city continued without interruption. But for Marcus, the place represented something more than a location. It represented a reminder that character is revealed in moments when nobody expects recognition. A young officer who had heard about the incident approached Marcus respectfully. He wanted to ask a question that had been on his mind. General Reynolds, after everything that happened, why did you choose to remain calm? Marcus looked at him and smiled slightly. Because anger can tell you what happened, but wisdom helps you decide what to do next. The answer was simple, but it carried decades of experience. Marcus knew that people often remembered dramatic moments, but true change usually came from quieter ones. It came from conversations. It came from reflection. It came from people deciding to become better than they were yesterday. Officer Derek Whitmore also carried the memory of that day. The experience changed the way he approached his responsibility. He learned that every person he encountered had a history he could not immediately see. A person walking down a street was not just a situation to manage. A person asking to be heard was not an obstacle. Every individual had a story. Every individual had value. Marcus never wanted the world to remember him only because of his military rank. Titles eventually fade. Positions eventually change. But the way someone treats others can leave a lasting impact. Years of service had taught him that leadership was not measured by how many people followed your orders. It was measured by how many people felt respected in your presence. The greatest victory that day was not that one person's identity was finally recognized. It was that a moment of misunderstanding became an opportunity for awareness. It showed that truth does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through patience, dignity, and the courage to stand firm without losing compassion. Marcus Reynolds walked away from that experience knowing one thing clearly. The strongest people are not those who use their power to make others feel small. The strongest people are those who have the power to do more, but choose to use it to make things better. Because in the end, Respect is not something a title can demand. It is something a person earns through every choice they make.